Hello, everyone. I am Tom Coffey, the president of the Louisville Forum. Welcome to our July 2024 program. The Louisville Forum programs typically meet at noon on the second Wednesday of each month here at Vincenzo's Restaurant downtown. All are welcome. Founded in 1984, 40 years ago, the Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group. We host debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our events, to join or to make a reservation, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Today's program, Amendment 2, should public dollars be provided to non-public schools? This topic encapsulates pretty much every part of the Louisville Forum mission. It is contemporary. The 2024 General Assembly voted to put this amendment on the ballot for this November. It greatly impacts Louisville, and it is indeed controversial. Prior General Assemblies have passed measures to permit public funds to go to charter schools before, as well as passing measures providing tax credits for families to pay for private schools. These laws have been struck down as unconstitutional. This Amendment 2 seems to have been specifically designed to get past any such court ruling by amending Kentucky's Constitution itself. The issue is, as everyone knows, I do as much research on these topics as I can before I come in. Unlike some of the judges in here who say I don't do enough research before I appear in their courtrooms. This issue is overwhelmingly partisan, but to be as accurate as possible is not entirely. In the Senate, all but 2 Republican senators voted in favor of putting the amendment on the ballot. Every Senate Democrat who cast a vote voted against it. In the House, 65 Republicans voted in favor, while 12 Republican House members actually voted no. Every Democrat in the House voted no. Governor Beshear has consistently been outspoken in his opposition to the amendment as well, and has vowed to see that it is defeated. With that, I'm very excited to introduce the speakers we have today. Maddie Shepard is sitting here to my left. Maddie is the president of the Jefferson County Teachers Association. Maddie began her career in education teaching elementary grades in Shelby County Public Schools in 2014 and worked as a deeper learning resource teacher in JCPS, and has worked as a deeper learning resource teacher in JCPS since 2017, coaching teachers in K-12 classrooms and all over Louisville. Maddie is also an alumni and winner of the Louisville Ignite Leadership Program, an alumni of the Emerge Kentucky program, past president of the Kentucky Council for Social Studies, former member of the Kentucky Humanities Board, 2022's Derby Diversity Week Government Partner of the Year, as well as co-author of the children's book, Bluegrass Bold, Stories of Kentucky Women. Maddie has a bachelor's degree in elementary education from the University of Kentucky, a master's degree in education leadership from Indiana University, a certification in education law from Indiana University, and achieved her rank 1 in 2024, graduating from the University of Kentucky's Change Maker program. Welcome, Maddie. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Thank you. Seated to my right is Jim Waters. Jim Waters is in his 13th year as the president of the Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions, a Kentucky free market think tank. His written columns have been published in newspapers and online publications across Kentucky and have appeared nationally in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. Jim is a frequent guest on Terry Miner's show on WHAS in Louisville, guest host on WVLK in Lexington, and appears on Kentucky TV newscasts, statewide public television forums on KET, and national radio talk shows. Jim is a proud Kentucky Colonel. He received his bachelor's degree from Summit Theological Seminary and has been one of the leading advocates calling for education policy reforms, including expanding educational alternatives. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
Maddie, if you would please start us off with your opening remarks.
Sure. I want to thank Tom and everyone for allowing this discussion to happen. This is a really important discussion for all of us to have, in addition to Kentucky voters. So thank you for having me. I'm Maddie Shepard. I'm the president of the Jefferson County Teachers Association. I'm a product of public schools. I went to Dixie Heights High School in Northern Kentucky. I'm a proud public school educator about halfway through my teaching career. And I'm here on behalf of both public school advocates and Kentucky advocates. I'm an educator, and so my main goal today is to educate. I hope that by the time everyone leaves, that the real facts are known about Amendment 2, the voucher amendment, how it will harm Kentucky kids, families, and the communities that depend on our public schools. And I'm in the spirit of education, I'm here to share a lot of those facts. The truth is that this amendment threatens to take critical resources away from schools. Resources that we could use to put a teacher in every classroom, and amidst the teacher shortage, we know we need that. A bus driver on every bus, and if you've been in Jefferson County and not under a rock, you know that that's needed for us too. And it's also needed for us to put the programs in place in our schools so that Kentucky kids have everything they need to thrive in tomorrow's economy and tomorrow's world. This amendment also is essentially a blank check. There is no proposed system that politicians in Frankfurt have put before us. This essentially asks us to give them permission to put that system up. And so we don't really know what we're voting on quite yet. This threatens to take our finite public dollars and put them into private schools that are largely unaccountable and don't have to jump through a lot of the hoops that provide the public oversight that public schools do. In addition, it will exacerbate the teacher shortage. And again, we don't know how much it'll end up costing taxpayers. I would argue that this actually is not a partisan issue. In Kentucky, whatever side of the aisle that you find yourself on, we've believed for decades that public education is important, and we've believed in the power of public education. Instead of delivering on this promise of quality public education for all, that's outlined in black and white and has been for over 100 years in our Constitution, a lot of out-of-state billionaires and people that stand to make profit off of our dollars and our public schools and our kids are trying to make sure that our public funds are diverted to unaccountable private schools. And they're trying to use this voucher amendment to siphon that much needed public funding away. Kentucky kids deserve schools where they're supported, where they're challenged, where they feel safe, like they belong, like they're accepted, where they can pursue their passions and talents, and where they can get the knowledge and skills that they need to keep Kentucky great and make Kentucky better. We won't be able to provide these things for kids if this amendment, the voucher amendment, is passed. Every kid, each and every kid, needs access to a quality public school. And in order for us to do that, we've got to keep public dollars in public school. And again, I thank you for having us here to have this discussion, and glad for the opportunity to share some of the facts and some of the realities around the amendment that's before us in November.
Thank you, Maddie. Jim, please.
Thanks, Tom, and I want to thank Lawrence Smith for his invitation to this event, to the Louisville Forum, and for your commitment to civil discourse on these important issues and to including other points of view. And thanks to Maddie Shepard as well for participating. Most of all, thanks to you for attending, for being members, for making this event possible. On November 5th, the voters of Kentucky will be asked to vote on Constitutional Amendment number 2. I like to say in Kentucky, we believe in the Second Amendment, but this is Amendment number 2. It will simply remove a legal barrier used by opponents of education freedom in the courtrooms to deny Kentuckians the same kind of choices available to parents in most other states. The opportunities that parents have in these other states, which we don't have in Kentucky, really fall into one of two categories: those involving public schools and those involving non-public schools. Public schools of choice are known as charter schools. Nearly 4 million children this past year attended 8,000 public charter schools in America. A majority of those students were low-income minority students. Charter schools are simply public schools that are granted charters to serve students with innovation and with flexibility. The students who attend there are there because their parents chose to send them there. The enrollments of charters are often determined by a random lottery among applicants. In many places around the country, mostly Democratic areas, by the way, New York City, Chicago, Washington, D.C., there are many more applicants than there are seats available, and so they have random lotteries. And these are public schools, charter schools are public schools funded by public dollars. There's never a cost to attend these schools, unlike some things I've heard said. Charter schools are open to all students, including those with special learning needs. In fact, there's a growing number of public charter schools in America today where a great majority of students are those with learning disabilities. The Tapestry Public Charter School in DeKalb County, Georgia, is filled with learning disabled students who are flourishing in the same school, the same classrooms, right next to students without those disabilities. Student academic performance in this school is off the charts. In the 2019 State College and Career Readiness Testing results, the last before the pandemic, Tapestry's middle and high school students with disabilities scored higher in English, math, science, and social studies than their peers in DeKalb County and nearby Fulton County, which includes the Atlanta Public Schools, which denied the opportunity to open another one of these schools that would help learning disabled kids. In 2022, the first year of testing results after the pandemic, Tapestry's performance in these key academic areas remained nearly as strong, while many of their peers in traditional public schools fell further behind. Now, this is not an attack on traditional public education. In fact, supporting charter schools is a way of expanding the public opportunities available to parents. It's not replacing, it's expanding. It's not in place of, it's in addition to. And our approach should be not to think about replacing, but expansion. After all, the main difference in students enrolled in that Tapestry school and those attending the traditional system is that those students in the Tapestry school are there because their parents chose it, while most children in traditional schools are there as the result of a local district's decision. 45 states and the District of Columbia have charter school laws. Kentucky's the only state where charter schools are legal but not funded. As Tom said, there was legislation passed and it's been challenged in court. The other type of educational choice program involves non-public schools. And the legislature also passed legislation allowing a scholarship tax credit and education opportunity accounts and several different things that they've tried to do. But the same superintendents and the same union leaders that oppose public charter schools also oppose that legislation using the same section of the Constitution. The Kentucky Supreme Court ruled against allowing these bills to be implemented, which is the first time that a Supreme Court in the United States at any level has ruled against such a school choice program. In its ruling, the court said that only by amending the Constitution will Kentucky's parents have the same kind of education choice available to parents in 33 other states in the form of 80 different programs serving 1 million children in non-public school choice programs. So I want to conclude with this. What this amendment does not do, this amendment does not create a specific school choice program. Voting yes on this amendment is not a vote for any particular program. Voting yes on this amendment is not a vote for a scholarship or voucher program. Voting yes on this amendment isn't a vote for a specific charter school bill. Voting yes on this amendment is not a vote for policy. It's simply a vote to allow the legislature to come back and decide what's best for Kentucky, what policy is best without it being stymied by the courts. So, when the Kentucky Education Reform Act was passed in 1990, we were told, by the way, that was the largest single tax increase in our history, $1 billion tax increase with CARA. But we were told, when that happens, we promise you, the supporters of CARA said, we'll close the gaps between racial groups, we'll close the gaps between haves and have-nots, we'll dramatically improve the proficiency rates, and we'll educate and prepare students for future academic and career success. But none of us, no matter what our political leanings, should be satisfied with the status quo where a majority of our public school students in Kentucky fail to acquire basic reading and math skills. None of us should be satisfied with a JCPS district which received $23,561 per student in 2022, and yet where test scores are lower, gaps between racial groups and income levels are wider, and spending is at the highest it's ever been in our county. And none of us should be satisfied with a school district with transportation policies that can't only figure out how to get kids to school, but are disproportionately failing to transport low-income and minority students. So voting no on this amendment simply means you're opposed to even having the discussion about school choice policies that around the country have improved the educational outcomes and often at lower rates of spending. I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you again, Maddie and Jim. Mike, hit us with that first one.
Yes. Welcome. And am I being heard? Am I being heard? There we go. Well, I can't help it, but I voted in the legislature for CARA in 1990. So it's just weird to hear that come up. So I have a pile of questions. And as the tradition of the Louisville Forum is to take the questions that are put together by the people in the audience and combine some, merge some, and most importantly, ask as many as we physically can. First question for both of you. If Amendment 2 passes and the legislature implements vouchers, would that allow tax dollars to pay for private schools that teach differently than the public schools teach? And the example given here, two examples. One, that the Holocaust never happened, or that the earth is flat. Who would like to go first on that one?
I'll jump in on that one. Thank you for whoever submitted the question. Jim got into this a little bit in his opening statements in that when voters are voting on this amendment in November, we are in fact not voting on a preconceived system or with preconceived parameters or requirements or accountability. We are essentially voting on whether or not we're going to give the politicians in Frankfort carte blanche to plan whatever this voucher system will look like. As an educator, I'm compelled to remind everyone that the legislators that are asking us to trust them to build this system by passing Amendment 2 are the same legislators that have for decades underfunded public servant pensions. These are for people who have given their life to serving the public, who have worked and earned their pensions, and that our legislators who are legally bound to pay for those have skirted on doing. These are the same legislators that have underfunded education for the past 20, 30 years. Both Andy Beshear and Daniel Cameron ran on giving teachers raises. The politicians in Frankfort that we have now have decided not to do that. For the last almost 20 years, since 2008, the same politicians in Frankfort that we're being asked to trust have underfunded transportation. And don't get me wrong, we have things we need to fix in JCPS and in Oldham County and in Shelby County and in all of the other districts that are experiencing transportation issues. But these issues have been a long time coming. To put it, really practically, we've been underfunded about $36,000 per bus driver for almost 20 years. So of course, while that underfunding has snowballed over that time, we're going to have the transportation issues have manifested before us this past year. So I'll just say we're being asked to trust the politicians in Frankfort to put together this system because the system does not exist. And because the system does not exist, there is no way for us to say, yes, there's accountability that would make sure that the private schools that are accepting vouchers are teaching, commonly accepted facts. There is no way to make sure that their financial decisions are made public and made accountable to the public who are funding these financial decisions. There is no way, because a lot of these schools are not held to the same standard and don't take the same kind of end-of-year assessments that public schools do. There is no way for us to say, that our students are learning at the same rates as they are in public schools. And so the two things that I would ask that you take away from this question are absolutely yes, that could happen, because in other states there is almost no oversight, and because the system does not exist in Kentucky and we're being asked to trust legislators to build it, there's no way for us to say that that accountability will exist. The second thing that I'd like you to take away from that is that the system doesn't exist, and we're being asked to trust politicians in Frankfurt to put that together. And again, these are the same people that have treated public education like a last priority. And in Kentucky, the people know that that's important. Teachers and communities that communities trust know that's important. And these are the last people that we should trust to put our education system together. So the short answer is yes, that can and will absolutely happen.
So I want to first of all thank our legislators for stepping up. They have increased funding to local districts, a lump sum funding, in addition to the SEEK dollars that have increased some. But they've increased, in the last few budget sessions, a tremendous amount of funding to local districts to provide for their teachers or whatever the need is. Teachers don't work for the state. Teachers work for their district. And so when the governor's out there hammering the legislature because they didn't give raises to teachers, I think that shows a lack of understanding of how this really works in our state, because teachers are hired and they're evaluated and they're paid by their local districts. So there's been a tremendous amount of increase in funding given to local districts, with the legislators saying, we're not going to tell you how to spend this. We're going to let you make that decision. And if you want to give teachers raises, we encourage that if that's needed. If something else is needed, if a program in a rural school that a student wants access to, a class or a subject is not available, you can use it for that. You can use it for transportation. So I think that that's really wrong and false to say that the legislature didn't give our teachers a raise. The legislators gave the local districts the money to do with what's needed there. And if that's raises, then that's what should happen. Another interesting thing I find on that is that, and I use 1990 because we've done quite a bit of research lately on how our public education system has performed since CARA was created. You can find that at BIPS.org, BIPPS.org. But since 1990, we have found that while per pupil funding has more than doubled in Kentucky, 122% increase, inflation adjusted in per pupil funding, teachers' salaries have not by any stretch increased to match that increase in funding. We've hired a lot more non-teaching staff, but yeah, teachers' salaries have not increased. So the question becomes, and you want to talk about transparency and accountability, where is that from the public education system? What's happening to those dollars, and why aren't our teachers benefiting from these tremendous increases in per pupil funding? If you talk about accountability as well, I don't know that there's any greater accountability than say in a charter school that has a charter for 5 years in which they promise we're going to perform at this level in exchange for the flexibility and innovation and some of the freedom from the rules that hold back great teachers in schools. We're going to perform at this level, and then when they're evaluated and they don't meet those standards, they can be shut down. And some are in our country. And I think that's the right thing. We don't want failing schools to continue to operate. But on the other hand, what greater accountability is there than parents deciding what they want their children to be taught and to learn? So the very radical, extreme example that was given there, I would say that most Kentucky parents are reasonable, and they wouldn't want their children to be taught that. On the other hand, they do want their children to graduate being able to read and being able to do math proficiently. So what greater accountability is there than parents making that decision? Because in a school of choice, if parents don't decide to send kids there, there is no school. In our public system, unfortunately, we don't have that kind of accountability. So I think the accountability issue is really in the public system. We need more of that.
I'll take this opportunity to elaborate a little bit more on some of the points that Jim made. So one of the first things that was discussed is around the funding that schools received. So again, I'm an educator. I'm going to take this opportunity to elaborate and educate. So what a lot of people may or may not know is that schools get their funding from a variety of sources. The three main sources are the local government, what can be raised by the local municipality, the state government, and the federal government. And how much a district receives from each of those funding bodies differs based on how much they can raise on their own. So for example, a district in rural Kentucky might have less ability to raise property taxes that go towards school funding than Louisville might. And so what Louisville receives from the state might be less and is often less than what a more rural area might receive from the state. So there's a couple funding mechanisms. What I'll also elaborate on is that while on paper, if we look at the raw numbers, it does appear that schools are receiving more than they ever have. The reason for that, though, is directly related to some of the points I made earlier about politicians in Frankfurt skirting what is owed to public servants. So what we see in those numbers that we look at on paper now that's given to public schools, a large portion of that is paying for the pensions that have been underfunded for decades. So while for decades, politicians in Frankfurt have decided not to pay the public pensions that have been earned by public servants, now they are in fact making good on that legal responsibility, which has inflated the money that schools appear to be receiving, or districts appear to be receiving. Not all of that money goes directly to schools or directly to teachers or directly to students because it's being used to pay off a debt that should have never been created. So just to kind of paint the full picture of how those numbers actually came to bear, a large portion of that is to pay for historically underfunded pensions.
Well, Jefferson County School District has a budget that's twice the size of the Metro Council budgets, over $2 billion. I think most reasonable Kentuckians would say that that's more than enough resources to educate 90,000 students here. I just don't think that that the resources are the problem. And I guess the question is, if it is the problem, how much is enough? I mean, $2 billion budget here, over 45 cents of every general fund dollar in Frankfurt goes to K through 12 education. How much more is going to be necessary before we say, well, maybe the problem isn't just resources. Maybe it is accountability. Maybe it is the need for parents to be empowered to make choices that force the public system to perform better.
That was the next piece that I was going to elaborate on, is the idea of accountability. And I'll just put a disclaimer out there. This is about to get real nerdy, and I'm really sorry about that. But the accountability piece, this is something my college self would laugh and probably gasp at me being able to talk about and even be remotely interested in. But it's important that we do talk about accountability, because what we think of as accountability and what we see in headlines is a lot different than what is actually the reality in schools or that students and teachers experience. So when we say the word accountability, as an educator, that means two things. Number one, it means how students are performing on state-mandated standardized tests that they take at the end of the year. We report our scores to the state. The state makes judgments on how well or not well we're doing based on those scores. So that's one element of accountability. The second element of accountability is financial accountability, because our schools are funded by our public dollars, and the public deserves some oversight on knowing how those dollars are spent. So those are the two kind of like buckets of accountability. What I'll also say about accountability is that the word proficiency is thrown around a lot, especially in October when every school's accountability state test scores are made public. And what's important to know, and this is the really nerdy part, so sorry about that, is that those state mandated tests are norm referenced. What that means, for those of us who may have zoned out a little bit in stats in college, is that students are compared to one another, not against a criteria. So in a norm reference test, psychometricians get together, sounds like a very riveting job, and they put together test questions that will produce a bell curve, quite literally. and they'll tweak the question. If they give a question and all of the students tested do really well on it, they'll make small tweaks to the question to produce a bell curve. And sometimes these tweaks aren't even academic. Sometimes the tweak might be, there might be a question, a comprehension question at the end of a passage, and the tweak might be to replace the word porch with veranda. Because a number of students that experience that question might not have ever heard the word veranda before, that's going to produce a different result than using the word porch. And so there's all these kinds of factors that go into producing these tests that students take one time in May, and then these scores are reported out. So they're norm referenced. Students are compared to one another. And when the tests are engineered to produce a bell curve, what happens is the test makers or test prep companies declare a proficiency level. And on a bell curve, more often than not, the proficiency level is declared at 60%. And so what that means is that two things. First, the test is designed to produce a bell curve where 60% score below that level. That's how they're designed. Those are the results they're always going to produce. 40% will score above that threshold. And so when we see a headline in the newspaper that says X number of students did not score proficient, that means they're part of the 60% that was quite literally engineered to produce that bell curve that did not meet that proficiency standard. It doesn't mean that they're illiterate and they can't read. It doesn't mean that they can't do math. It only means that they did not meet that benchmark, of which 60% of Kentuckians did not meet by design. So when we talk about accountability, it's important for us to know that when those headlines come out, that it's not necessarily a reflection of who can read or who can do math. It's more closely a reflection of how students compare to one another and how they score on that statistically created bell curve. Now, that's not to say that we don't have work to do in education in Kentucky or JCPS. Please don't hear me saying that. We absolutely do. But to do this work, we need the funding to put teachers in every classroom, bus drivers on every bus, and the types of programs that offer personalization and more partnership with the community, and to expand the existing nationally recognized CTE programs we have at many of our high schools. So we can do more, but we need the funding to do so. We won't be able to do that if our funding is quite literally siphoned to private schools. So I wanted to make sure to expand on the accountability piece and to reiterate the piece about funding. Again, just to drive it home, on paper, the numbers do look larger than they've ever been, but that's because the legislature is finally paying the bill that they've skirted for many years on public servant pensions.
Did you want to respond, Jim?
Actually, public education funding has increased every year since CARA, with the exception of the recession years, a few years in there. It's increased every year. That's not just pension payments, although that's part of it. But if you listen here, it's all about funding a system. It's all about funding the adults, the bus drivers and the staff and the buildings. Our approach, we prefer to fund the education of students and let the system adjust to that. If our system is doing great, then I think we should have enough confidence in parents to make that decision. They're going to send their children to the place that's educating their children. But for those who need something different, we're denying them any opportunities, and we're talking about funding the system. I'm not interested in what system the legislators come up with. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about making sure that every child in Kentucky has the opportunity to get a great education that prepares them for the future. And it's about having that discussion. You know, Mark Twain said that when the world came to an end, he wanted to be in Kentucky because we're always 20 years behind, you know? And I think there's the upside of that is we can see all the great school choice programs and all the ones that didn't work across the country. And when legislators come back, we can have that debate about what will work best here. But to deny even that discussion is, I think, harmful to many kids in this community in particular. And by the way, it's not just the state testing scores that have suggested we have serious academic problems here. The National Association of Educational, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, has even worse outcomes for our 4th and 8th graders in reading and math. Also, the ACT average for 11th graders has fallen in Kentucky. It's not just our state test. It's many different assessments are all saying and sending the same message, that we're failing to educate a majority of our students. So that should be our concern, first of all, not the systems, not the pension system, not the buildings, not the capital. All those things need to be decided based on what works best for students.
Well, thank you, Jim and Maddie. I want to make sure that our members' questions, if you want to, sure. Mike, thank you both. Thank you. Mike, go ahead.
We've had over 20 questions, so clearly this is an issue that people are reacting to.
That's good.
First, this next question, and who started first last time? The other person will start first this time.
That's
if
me.
charters are if charters are thriving partly because of fewer rules, why not change the rules for public schools?
Good question. Thank you for that question. We've heard that statement made before, and the question there, though, is would our union friends and those who do the collective bargaining agreement here be for allowing the kind of flexibility and innovation that charter schools have in order to achieve this? And that's where the problem comes is we have visited charter schools where the teacher will not pass the student to the next day until they've mastered the material for that day, much less the next year. Unfortunately, many of the rules that our teachers in the traditional public schools operate under is they're not allowed to give that kind of attention. So are we going to actually allow parents to choose too? What if we made all of Jefferson County Public School District a charter school district? I think that would work. We would allow parents to make those decisions, and there would be a higher level of accountability because each one of those schools would have to be accountable for how they perform with their students. So the problem is the unions aren't going to do that, and the bureaucracy is not going to do that. This is their turf, and they're not going to be willing to allow that kind of choice and that kind of freedom to take place. I'm for more freedom, education freedom for parents. I trust parents more than I do the bureaucracy in our state. And I say that with all respect, but it's certainly true.
First, I'll start by just, again, educating. We don't have charters in Kentucky. While we do have legislation that allows it, we don't have a single charter school. So just to be very clear, this amendment is not about charter schools. This is about providing vouchers for families to use to attend private schools. Second, what I'll say is that this doesn't work. In almost every state, if not all, where this type of system exists, students are performing no better, and in many situations worse academically than their similarly situated counterparts in public schools. For example, again, sorry to get real nerdy, in Alabama, the 2013 Alabama Accountability Act found that schools accepting vouchers generally failed to meet proficiency benchmarks that public schools are held to. In Florida and Louisiana, we saw the same results. In Indiana, it's much worse. A multi-year longitudinal study found that substantial student achievement loss happened, especially in the area of math. So in all of these situations, all of the states that have had voucher programs the longest, students are not only not keeping pace with their public school counterparts, they are in fact falling behind. In North Carolina doesn't even require schools that accept vouchers to be accredited. So we're not talking about, private schools or even charter schools are accepting vouchers. We're talking about adults in basements teaching. They're accepting public dollars for the students enrolled in their schools. The final kind of nerdy statistic I'll share with you is from the conservative-leaning pro-voucher Fordham Institute. The Fordham Institute surveyed this as well and found that students across the board in all of the states that they surveyed were performing worse academically in schools that accepted vouchers when compared to students in public schools. But it's not all about what we should avoid. this is about what we want to build in Kentucky. And yes, teachers all over the state feel really hamstrung by a lot of the accountability measures that we have in place. That's true. I would say, as an educator who's halfway through my career and been in the classroom in a couple counties in Kentucky, that we're not measuring all the things that we care about. Of course, reading and literacy and math are really important, but so is being able to collaborate on a team with other people. So is being able to read research that might be misleading or leave out facts and look at things with a critical eye. So is being able to be creative and invent something new, especially in this area or this era of AI, where a lot of the kind of thoughtless rote tasks that humans used to perform are now done by AI. So we should be measuring and investing in all of the things that we care about, not just reading and math. And then lastly, I will say that this is about freedom. Every person in Kentucky, every family, every parent in Kentucky deserves the freedom to look at the public school options that are free to them and say, these are all great options. That's a right that all of our Kentucky families have, and that's a right that Kentucky families will lose if money is siphoned away from our public schools and given to private schools that largely are serving kids using vouchers that have already been there. In almost every state, if not all, that have these types of systems, the majority of the students that are using vouchers were already previously enrolled in public schools. In Ohio and Indiana, the places that are closest to us, it's pretty bad, with about 60% of students using vouchers already in public schools. So this is being used to subsidize 60% of students' tuitions that were already, were already able to afford this in private schools. But it's worse in other states. In Florida, it's 75%. In New Hampshire, 98% of students using vouchers were already enrolled in private schools. In Kentucky, where we care about every parent having the freedom to choose a great free public school, we can't afford to subsidize private school tuitions for people that are already paying for that.
If you want, Mike, I liked your suggestion before, Mike. Each person gets an opportunity to go first. So in this next question, for Maddie and Jim, you can respond. Go ahead, please, Mike.
You've discussed the notion of parents' involvement in their education, and it's axiomatic that a student does better whose parents care more about education. With that in mind, will this not empower kids whose parents care more and leave behind kids whose parents, for whatever reason, not because they're bad people, because they're so busy in life, because they've had troubles in life, because they didn't like school, for whatever reason, how is this going to increase that divide?
Was that a question for both, Mike? Was that,
Yes.
Okay. But Maddie, you can take that first. And Jim.
Sure. I'm, like I said, a person who's worked in schools for a long time, and I've never experienced a parent that didn't care to some degree. What I have experienced are parents that care a lot, but don't have the resources to show that care. And so I would like to reframe the question. We're not talking about parents who care and parents who don't, or families that care and families that don't. We're talking about families that have an abundance of resources and families that don't. And yes, this will absolutely, as previously stated, but I'll share again, this will absolutely take public funding away from public schools that everyone, no matter your resources, no matter your zip code, can access, and put them into private schools, where again, the majority of families that are accessing this type of voucher are already in private schools. So we already see an economic divide in Louisville and across Kentucky. Taking public funding away from public schools to subsidize private tuition for families that already are well-resourced and can afford this, of course will exacerbate that divide.
So, yeah, you talked about caring about parents that don't have the resources, who care but don't have the resources. That's really what educational choice and freedom is all about, is helping parents who need that help. We do have school choice in Kentucky. If you're wealthy and you have means, you can write a check to a private school for tuition, you can move to a different district, you have choice. But what we need to do is provide some options for parents who don't have the resources, as you so rightly said. They care, but they don't have the resources, and we should give them that option. You know, we have several hospitals in Louisville, but I don't ever hear anyone say that we're diverting money from Norton Hospital to Baptist Hospital just because a patient uses their Medicare benefit at Baptist Health. I mean, we don't talk that way because we know Medicare dollars are a public good for which we give the beneficiary the dignity of choosing where they access their health care and getting the health care that is best for them, that best meets their need. It's no different with K through 12 education. Just like Medicare dollars don't belong to the hospitals, education dollars don't belong to a specific system or school. The governor said this is a direct attempt to defund our public school system. But would anyone say that offering patients a choice on where to spend their Medicare dollars is an attempt to defund the hospitals or the healthcare providers? Or does anyone say that food stamps are an attempt to defund Kroger's and put Walmart out of business? Just because we give the people who receive those benefits an option of where to use them that works best for them. And, you know, I think, and back to the point too about how schools of choice are doing around the country, I would like to point you to a study by Stanford University there that said, looking at year-to-year academic progress from 2015 to 2019, the typical charter school student in our national sample had reading and math gains that outpaced their peers in their traditional public schools that they would have otherwise have attended. So this needs to be about helping students, focusing on students. And this amendment, the governor called it a voucher amendment. My opponent here today called it a voucher amendment. But it doesn't have a voucher in it. It doesn't have a tax credit policy. It's simply a discussion to get this out and have this debate about how schools of choice are doing. If our public system is doing great, why would there be any concern about offering and expanding and offering parents a few choices? What would be the issue there? And I will say this in Florida. When CARA was passed, Florida trailed Kentucky in almost every key academic area and was spending more. In the intervening years, Florida is now at the top of the nation in reading and math scores in particular. And what's been the major difference is they now have 500,000 students in Florida who are taking advantage of some kind of school choice program. And yes, public charter schools are school choice programs because they don't exist if parents don't choose to send children there. So those are school choice programs. Florida has outpaced us. And by the way, Florida has become a majority minority state. Where now they have 60% of their students in the public school system are not white. Over 70% of students in Kentucky's system are white, and generally you are expected to do better on testing, and yet we have Florida minority students who are outperforming students here in Kentucky, and they've increased spending less than we have over the intervening years.
Jim, I have to follow up on that point. You're saying, it seems to me you have said that the legislature is going to start with a clean slate, but you, of course, are deeply involved in this process. So are you previewing for us that the legislature is going to say, okay, everybody gets X number of dollars to spend on education, no. Spend it where you want it, as we do our Medicare?
Yeah. I was using that as a principle to show that we give people choices with public dollars, and it doesn't implode the system, it makes it better. So, no, let me be clear. The amendment does not contain any policy, and I think Maddie said this as well. There's no specific school choice policy in the amendment. It simply allows us to have this discussion. By the way, if the amendment doesn't pass, what's going to happen to all of those schools that we are already currently funding with public dollars that would not be considered common schools? Magnet schools, you have to be admitted. The Kentucky School for the Blind, the Kentucky School for the Deaf, the Craft Academies, the Gatton Academies, those would not fit the judge's description of a common school in his ruling. So if this amendment doesn't pass, what's going to happen to the constitutionality of those schools as well?
Maddie?
Sure. First, I'd love to say that I would love for schools to be funded at the levels that hospitals are. I'd love for teachers to be paid like doctors are. So like that's a reality that I'm not opposed to. We're also not talking about charter schools. When we look at, charter school statistics, which, side note, are all over the place because we don't have the accountability measures anywhere to have the same types of data to be able to compare them to public schools. So we don't have charter schools. And making this comparison, again, that doesn't exist in Kentucky, is like comparing apples to kumquats. They're, not even in the same fruit section at Kroger. There is a lot to fear. Jim asked, what's the what's the problem? What's the issue? The fact of the matter is that our tax dollars are finite. What people are willing to, give as their membership fee to be a member in a civilized society that offers services and goods to its constituents is limited. What people are able to put into that pot is limited. And so I would love to be able to say that this is a both and more or a make the pie bigger type of situation, but it just isn't. And when there's a voucher on the ballot or an amendment on the ballot that threatens to take finite resources away from already woefully, historically underfunded public schools and give it to private schools who, again, this is largely going to students and families that are already in private schools to subsidize their tuition. We can't afford that in Kentucky. And the fact is that other states can't either. Arizona and Florida, their budgets for this type of thing has absolutely ballooned over time. One, because it's difficult to anticipate how many people are going to use this, so it's tough to know how much it'll cost. And it's even tougher in Kentucky because, as Jim and I have both said, we're not voting for any specific system or any specific voucher cost. We don't know what's going to happen if this passes. So there is a lot to fear. What I'll also say, too, about the Florida point is that in addition to instituting vouchers at a large scale, Florida has also made a number of changes to their accountability system, their benchmarks. There are lots of factors that have changed in Florida over the past couple years. And so it's really impossible to pinpoint, what was the factor that really moved the needle on their achievement, which again, achievement is a misleading term because of the testing pieces that I went over earlier. But the fact of the matter is that this amendment is asking us to vote on whether or not we want to sign a blank check to people in Frankfurt that have underfunded education for years, and to people in Frankfurt that have not come through on their legal liability to fund public pensions for people that have given their lives to public service. And that we are looking at finite funds. Schools need this. And while, we can say this money is for kids all day long, who teaches the kids? Who drives them to school? Who accesses the programs they need to be able to build skills and dispositions to make Kentucky and keep Kentucky great? That's teachers and bus drivers. That's all the support staff that we have in schools. And so, of course, our funding should go to kids. But at the end of the day, we need funding to pay the adults that show up to these schools every day to make sure that kids have everything they need.
I may just interject real quick. I think we're running out of time. How about you guys each have, can you guys each give a closing remark in a minute? Does that sound good?
Sure, I'll go last.
Sure.
All right.
Did you say in a minute or 1 minute?
Well, if you could each take a minute. No, if you could each take 1 minute, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
You can go ahead, Maddie, if you don't.
Sure. So I'm going to reiterate a lot of the points we've talked about today. The first thing I'll say is that as I'm sitting here before you, I'm halfway through my career. I'm currently the president of the Jefferson County Teachers Association. I was elected by teachers to represent teachers. But before I was in this position, I worked as a resource teacher in JCPS at the district level. And so I had the pleasure and the opportunity of working in literally every school and with almost every teacher pre-K to 12 in JCPS. While I was running for election, I actually did the math, and throughout my tenure in JCPS, there's less than 10 schools I haven't been in. And what I'll say is that the closer that you get to a school, the harder they are to criticize. In JCPS specifically, and I know these facts because I'm here, 80% of our teachers have a master's degree or higher. We have the highest concentration of educators with postmaster's degrees, with doctorate degrees, with specialist degrees than anywhere else in Kentucky. So like, we have the people to do this. And the people that know the most about what schools need are kids and teachers. So when you're out in the community, when you're researching, when you're reading, I just say, give teachers an ear, because we're in schools every day. We've given our lives to this profession. We're here to serve the community. And, we're here to tell you that we need every penny that Kentucky is willing to give when it comes to public schools. I'll be a little doom and gloom for a little bit before finishing with, some hope. We do have some challenges in JCPS for sure. We are one of the most populous landing spots for new immigrants to the United States. If you were to take all of the English language learners we have in our district and put them in their own district, we'd be the fourth largest, or they would be the fourth largest in the state. And so, of course, when a person is in a new country and learning a new language, that fact is going to show up on their, state accountability assessments. And so the narrative that JCPS is failing or that kids can't read is just patently false. We face challenges that other districts face, but not at the scale that we face them. And we are charged with serving a community that needs us really badly. A stat that Dr. Polio shares a lot of times, I wish he would share more often, is that our free and reduced lunch population has ballooned over the last 10 or 15 years. And so while, we're serving students that require help paying for food, that require help paying for their bills and housing at home, the number of students that we support in those types of situations has increased exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years. And so the challenge we have before us is very great. However, the bright spots that we have before us are also great. Even though that JCPS educates 20% of Kentucky's students, we have 40% of the highest performing high schools. We have the most nationally recognized academy
Maddie,
programs.
we're actually really running out of time. If you don't mind, I got to give Jim his fair, but go ahead.
Sir, I've planned too much for this lesson, so sorry. I'll just end by saying that this is a zero-sum game. Funds are finite, and we cannot let the finite funds that we have go away from public schools that need them, that serve everyone, to private schools that are unaccountable to the public.
Thank you, Maddie. Go ahead.
I'm really glad to hear the union say that resources are finite, because every time there's a call for spending increase in education, no matter what, they're for it. But what we need are we need more educated students. That's what we need. And I want to say that the results in terms of academic performance are not just limited. The problems aren't just limited to Jefferson County. In our state right now, a majority of our students, even according to the state testing system, are not reading proficiently and not doing math proficiently. And only about 15% of our black students are performing proficiently in these key academic areas. Since 1990, the number of non-teaching staff has grown by 55%, while the number of teachers has increased by 21%, all while the number of students rose only by 5%. So what we need here is a system that educates students, and it's not getting done. I have not heard any other ideas today about how that could happen. We know from other states that offering parents choice has created an appropriate kind of pressure on the public education system to change. It's all fine and good for us to sit here and talk about it, but there's been no pressure for the system to change. But we found in states like Florida, like Arizona, like many other states, that having choice for parents forces the public education system to respond. I mean, in Indiana, the public schools have advertised how much they've improved their academic results in order to get students back into their school. The question earlier about what happens to children whose parents don't care enough to get involved or maybe can't, They benefit too, because like in Florida, the more choice parents have had, the better their public education system has performed. It creates that dynamic, and it works in every other area of our society. Why won't we give it a chance here? I think we should. And I appreciate your attention today, and this has been a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone.